My name is Mike McDermott, and in this video, we're going to take a look at a campaign that had far-reaching implications. The surrender of a relatively small British army in upstate New York resulted in political shifts worldwide, far beyond the importance of that military action. In 1777, the British began to put into effect a strategy that included three different British forces. Two originated in Canada, were supposed to come together and to begin to move down and control the Hudson River Valley. The third force was the British Army in New York, and in cooperation, they were going to seal off the New England states and begin the process of what they hoped would be a successful divide and conquer strategy. The 1777 strategy failed for a variety of reasons, but even had it been successful, I suspect that its purpose would never have actually been realized. The British forces were not large enough to really curtain off New England. And as they came to learn over the next several years, even controlling major American cities did not control the colonies. The majority of Americans at that time didn't live in those big cities. They were rural rustics. They were on farms, or they were in small crossroad villages all across the colonies, and they were largely self-sufficient. They were independent-minded, and they were very leery of giving their undivided loyalty to some distant English king. And in fact, it took some time for most of those rural Americans to begin to give their loyalty to the growing idea of American independence. So at any rate, in 1777, the British strategy was to begin a process of conquering the rebellion. And now let's take a look at the specifics of the campaign, the Saratoga campaign. In the summer of 1777, the British put into motion a strategy that they hoped would deal a fatal blow to the American rebellion. The plan called for three columns to converge and control the strategically important Hudson River Valley, isolating New England from the other colonies. On 14 June, the first column of over 8,000 men, commanded by General John Burgoyne, and comprised of British regulars, German mercenaries, loyalist militia, Indians, and 138 pieces of artillery, departed from St. John's to advance south by way of Lake Champlain and into the Hudson River Valley. Their first objective was Fort Ticonderoga, which was garrisoned by 3,000 American soldiers and commanded by General Arthur St. Clair. When those Americans discovered British cannon atop nearby hills, they abandoned the supposedly impregnable position and began a retreat to Fort Edward, which was north of Saratoga, New York. Their withdrawal sparked a public and a political uproar that cost General St. Clair his command. The Continental Congress condemned him for the loss of Fort Ticonderoga, but others saw the situation differently. An army surgeon, a man named Dr. Thatcher, predicted the loss of the fort, apparently so calamitous, will ultimately prove advantageous by drawing the British Army into the heart of our country and thereby place them more immediately within our power. Private Park Holland recalled an incident that described another but more immediate aspect of the campaign, and he later wrote, "While we were at Fort Edward, two of our officers, Lieutenant Sawyer and Sergeant Rogers, thought they would visit some of their friends. They proceeded about 600 feet when a dozen Indians came out of the woods and in plain sight of us, killed them both and scalped them before we could reach the spot. When we arrived, there lay the bodies of our friends. who had left us but a moment before. A more horrid sight is rarely seen than what was now presented to our view. Not an Indian was to be found. We bore the bodies of our friends back and buried them. A second British column led by General Barry St. Leger left Montreal on 23 June with a force of about 2,000 men, half of them Iroquois Indians. Moving east through the Mohawk River Valley toward Albany, they laid siege to Fort Stanwix on the 2nd of August. 4 days later, the British and Indians were forced to confront an American relief column, while their unprotected camp was surprised and raided by the fort's garrison. That was enough for the Indians, and they departed to return home to Canada, and General St. Leger had to abandon his advance as well, and he also turned back. The intended third column was General William Howe's command in New York, but he chose to occupy Philadelphia instead, and his focus was on General Washington and General Washington's Continental Army, and he chose to not support General Burgoyne's advance down the Hudson River Valley. Even though General Burgoyne did not receive the support he expected, he decided to press on and to secure the town of Albany as his base. As the supply lines became more tenuous, the Americans conducted a scorched earth campaign and destroyed foodstuffs and forage in his path while harassing his lines of communication and slowing down his advance. The British force, now reduced to about 7,000 men, was finally blocked at a location called Bemis Heights by General Horatio Gates' force of 9,000 soldiers. The American position commanded the only road through a very steep defile between Bemis Heights and the Hudson River, thus channeling the British Army. On 18 September, initial contact was made, and the following day, the Americans moved forward from their position on the heights and met the British on farmland owned by a loyalist named John Freeman. A British attempted a flank movement. The Americans countered it, and more troops were fed into the battle by both sides as the day progressed. After dark, the Americans pulled back to their prepared positions, leaving the enemy in possession of Freeman's farm. The British suffered about 600 casualties during the fight, while nearly 300 Americans were killed or wounded. General Burgoyne went into camp expecting reinforcements from New York, but when none arrived, he renewed his assault on the 7th of October. By then, the British were reduced to about 6,600 effectives, while the American position had been strengthened and now numbered nearly 12,000 men. The British attack failed, and the survivors were pursued back to their camp by Americans led by General Benedict Arnold, who was badly wounded late in the day. The British managed to slip away that night, and by 13 October they were surrounded and under cannon and small arms fire in defensive positions around the village of Saratoga. The next day, General Burgoyne opened negotiations with General Gates, and 3 days later bowed to the inevitable and capitulated to the Americans. British losses totaled 440 men killed, 695 wounded, and 6,220 men surrendered, while American casualties included 90 soldiers killed and 240 wounded. The Battle of Freeman's Farm was a revelation to Lieutenant William Digby, serving with a British regiment. He had never dreamed of such an explosion of fire as he heard, and later recalled, "We remained in our ranks that night, and though we heard the groans of our wounded and dying at a small distance, yet could not assist them until morning, not knowing the position of the enemy." The following morning, his companion, a Lieutenant Arbery, was assigned to a burial detail, and he wrote, "I observed a little more decency than some parties have done, who who left legs, heads, and arms sticking out of the ground. No other distinction is paid to officers or soldiers than that the officers are put into a hole by themselves. Our army abounded with young officers, and in the course of this unpleasant duty, 3 were interred together. The age of the oldest was 17 years. So these were brand new ensigns or second lieutenants serving with the British force. Another British soldier was surprised by his experience. He wrote, "The courage and the obstinacy with which the Americans fought, under the astonishment of everyone, and we now become fully convinced that they are not that contemptible enemy that we had imagined, incapable of standing a regular engagement." What he discovered was those Americans were perfectly willing to stand fast and exchange fire. Hannah Warren wrote her impression of the defeated British and Germans as they marched through Cambridge a month later. And in her diary, she wrote, "Last Thursday, which was a very stormy day, a large number of British troops came through the town. They kept their ranks, but on Friday, we heard the Hessians were to make a procession as well. To be sure, the sight was truly astonishing. I never had the least idea that the Creator produced such a sordid set of creatures in human form." Now she's talking about these German mercenaries and their camp followers. "Poor, dirty, emaciated men, great numbers of women who seemed to be the beasts of burden, having a bushel basket on their back by which they were bent double. The contents seemed to be pots and kettles, various sorts of furniture, children peeping through gridirons, some very young infants who were born on the road, the women in bare feet, clothed in dirty rags. Such effluvia filled the air." The outcome of the surrender of the British Army at Saratoga encouraged the French to open formal negotiations with the American government, and the resulting Franco-American alliance moved the conflict onto a world stage. French assistance, to include much needed money, became a major factor in the ultimate success of the American cause, which eventually, of course, came to fruition at Yorktown. And thus closed the campaign at Saratoga, New York, 1777. Let me know in your comments your feelings concerning how I approach describing these campaigns. And until then, all the best to each and every one of us, and may God bless America.